Hi, my name is Alex, and on this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I have a cat. Hi, so to give you an idea of what we're actually going to be doing in this video, we're not sculpting cats. We are going to be doing a focus on anatomy, specifically on arms and torsos. So, before we start, one of the things I wanted to talk about was posing your miniature and how to create dynamic poses and making sure that your miniatures don't look stale or just kind of flat and boring. And the first thing that I always do, as you can see me do here, is I bend the spine. So depending on what pose your miniature is going to be doing, the spine is going to be bent differently, but almost never is your spine going to be perfectly straight. So that should always be the first thing that you do when you start posing your miniature. The other thing that I do, obviously, is I put in the shoulders. But one thing to note when you are posing the shoulders of your miniature is that your shoulders are not actually stationary. They pivot at your clavicle just a little bit, obviously not as much as your arm would, but they actually move forward and backwards. And if you just you can actually just do this yourself and you realize just how much you can move your shoulders forward and backwards. And so you want to keep that in mind when you're posing your miniature. Like for this character, one of his arms is going to be far back. And so you can kind of see it here where his shoulders aren't necessarily a straight line. His one shoulder is pulled way back and his other shoulder is kind of pushed forward a little bit. You can also see the curvature of the spine right here. Now, with our kind of Superman pose out of the way, we can actually start adding our first layer of green stuff. And this, again, is fairly basic. You just want to add a thin layer of green stuff over the entirety of the miniature. And once you've got like a really thin layer over everything, I usually build up the chest and torso area a little bit, since that's going to be built up a little bit more in a way that the arms or limbs won't be. And now I can actually get to the musculature. And obviously the first thing I want to tell you guys is you have to be using a reference for this. It's often helpful to have a reference pose as well, but also just having anatomy of what you're trying to sculpt up on your computer or whatever is very, very important. That way you know what muscles are where and also how each muscle is connected or beside all the muscles that are around it. And so having reference is super, super important. The other thing that I really wanted to mention, and I think the main focus of what I want to talk about in this video, was how musculature actually works and how you can make your anatomy look more dynamic. And that is the fact that your muscles are going to be stretching and compressing depending on what position they're in. So for this guy, right now I'm working on the pecs, and the pecs for his left arm is going to be stretching because his left arm is pulled back. And so that's going to be a little bit flatter and not quite as prominent as his right pecs, which is in a little bit more of a neutral point, so it's not really being stretched or compressed too much because of where his arm is kind of just hanging down loosely. The other way that these the muscles might stretch and compress is if you have like the abs, they're going to almost like accordion depending on the position, right? You're not going to be able to, they're going to be a lot smaller and thinner and compressed when you have the miniature in a pose like this, whereas they're going to be a lot longer if, let's say, he was kind of leaning back and his like back was arched. One thing that I also wanted to mention was that it can be good to make some details a little bit more subtle. Even if you want to have a very, very musculature character, he's very small, so you won't necessarily be able to see every single detail. And so oftentimes in these very small areas, you can just have more implications of the detail rather than having every single part fully addressed, so to speak. If I was making this miniature on a larger scale, I would definitely make sure that these details are a lot more defined and prominent, but for now we kind of have a little bit of leeway just because of how tiny this miniature is. As I'm working on this miniature, I keep adding the rest of the anatomy. Here I'm adding I want to say it's the lats, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know their name, I just know that they're there, which also are going to be, will accordion depending on if you're maybe your miniature is reaching up for something. They're going to accordion or compress in the same way that the abs might. But with those finished, I move on to the back. And now the main thing you want to focus on, as far as I'm concerned, on the back is going to be the shoulder blades. Because similar to the way the pecs will move depending on where the arms are, the shoulder blades are going to be more prominent if your arm is farther back than it will be if your arm is stretching forward. As well as the shoulder blade simply being more prominent on an arm like the left arm of this guy, it's also probably going to be closer to the spine the farther back your arm is going to be going. So this shoulder blade that you can see here, I've tried to make it a lot bigger and kind of sticking out more than the other shoulder blade that I'm continue to work on later, which again is in more of a resting position than the other one since the arm is just kind of hanging a little bit more loosely, not doing anything particularly dynamic. I then add a little bit more green stuff so that I can sculpt in the spine, as well as making sure to finish all of the rest of the muscle groups that are on the back, which aren't quite as defined as most other places on the body. And then I can start working on the arms. So here you can see I add a little bit of green stuff for the shoulders. And the shoulders, as you can see from your reference, are actually more like 3 kind of muscles right next to each other. And the main thing I want to focus on when doing this is making sure that the shoulder blends well with the pecs as well as the shoulder blade. So obviously making it sure it's the right shape for the arm, but those transitions are really, really important to make sure that everything feels unified and not like the arm is just glued onto the torso. And again, the best way to do this is making sure that you have reference for both your pose and for just anatomy in general pulled up on your second monitor or whatever. And that will help you also get in those little details for where the kind of 3 muscles that make up the shoulder are actually like located. Then after that, I move on to work on the arms. And this is again very similar to our process beforehand, using a reference to make sure we actually know where all the muscles are supposed to be, and keeping in mind the stretching and compression of all the muscles depending on what position they're in. The reason I want to stress that part of it is that because reference is really helpful, right? It tells you what you're supposed to be doing. But if you actually have an understanding of why certain things look a certain way, it helps you kind of go beyond just what the reference is doing, especially because most of the time you're not going to be able to find a 3D reference. So as you're adding muscle groups, you actually have some understanding of what's happening and why, and that way you can interpret your reference in the best way possible. You're not just following it hoping that you can do something similar. You actually have a solid understanding of why the muscles are doing what they're doing and how you can almost improvise in the absence of a specific detail that might be missing in your reference or something like that. And also something you guys will probably have noticed is that so far this guy has definitely skipped leg day, and mostly I'm not bothering with doing legs at this point because I find myself in my sculpts I almost never sculpt legs. So not only am I not particularly good at it, but I also just almost never do it, so it wasn't like really a priority for this kind of anatomy video. You're mostly going to be doing arms and torsos and stuff like that. So, I hope you guys found this video helpful. I give you a little bit of a better idea of how to approach anatomy, which can be very important, especially if you're doing like barbarian type miniatures and that kind of stuff. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any advice for how I can kind of make these how-to videos a little bit better, especially with anatomy. I know that's a specific, very difficult thing to do. So hopefully this gave you a better sense of how to approach sculpting anatomy with your miniatures. But nonetheless, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, again, leave a comment, like, subscribe, hit the bell, all that good stuff. It's super helpful for a growing channel. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Behold the chunk.